Picture this. You're standing in an empty parking lot. Weeds push through cracked asphalt. A faded sign still bears the backwards R in rainbow colors, that iconic logo that once promised wonder. Through dusty windows, you can almost see the ghost of what was. Towering aisles of action figures, bicycles suspended from ceilings, the cacophony of electronic toys all chirping at once. You can almost smell it, that distinctive scent of new plastic, cardboard packaging, and possibility. This was Toys R Us. For generations of children, it wasn't just a store. It was a destination, a cathedral of childhood dreams where birthday money burned holes in pockets and wish lists came to life. Parents walked these aisles with glazed expressions and thinning wallets. Kids rode in oversized shopping carts, eyes wide with possibility, while Jeffrey the Giraffe smiled down from every corner. At its peak, Toys R Us was an American institution, an $11.8 billion empire with 1,600 stores spanning the globe. It was the undisputed king of toy retail, the place where childhoods were made, where Christmas morning began weeks early in fluorescent-lit aisles stretching toward infinity. But today, those stores stand empty. That parking lot sits silent. Jeffrey the Giraffe has been retired, not once, but twice. The company that defined toy retail for over 6 decades collapsed in 2018, taking with it not just a business, but a cultural landmark, a piece of collective memory. This is not a story about a store that couldn't compete. This is the story of how Toys R Us had every advantage: brand recognition, customer loyalty, market dominance, and squandered it all by standing still while the world sprinted forward. Before the bankruptcy and liquidation, before the empty shelves and going out of business signs, before Amazon and Walmart crushed it beneath their algorithms and economies of scale, there was a man named Charles Lazarus who had a simple, revolutionary idea. What if there was a store that sold only toys? This is the story of how that idea built an empire, and how refusing to change destroyed it. Washington, D.C., 1948. Post-war America was experiencing a baby boom of historic proportions. Young couples, flush with optimism and GI Bill mortgages, were filling new suburban homes with children. The average family had 3.8 kids. Cribs were selling faster than manufacturers could build them. Charles Lazarus, a 25-year-old furniture maker's son, his father's shop sold baby furniture and business was booming. But Charles saw beyond the immediate need. They need things. They want things. And parents, eager to give their children the childhood they'd been denied during the Depression and war years, were willing to spend. So Charles opened Children's Bargain Town in Washington, D.C., initially selling baby furniture, but quickly pivoting when he noticed something remarkable. Parents kept asking him, "Do you sell toys?" The question was revelatory. In 1948, toys weren't a category. They were an afterthought, scattered across department store corners or tucked into five-and-dime shops. There was no dedicated toy retailer. Charles saw the future clearly: a supermarket for toys. Not a boutique with a curated selection, but a warehouse of abundance where every toy imaginable lived under one roof. In 1957, he opened the first Toys R Us in Rockville, Maryland. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Toys R Us wasn't fancy. It was a stripped-down warehouse with industrial shelving, fluorescent lighting, and inventory stacked to the ceiling. No frills, no decoration, just volume, variety, and value. The tagline captured it perfectly: the biggest toy store there is. The backwards R in the logo, a playful touch suggesting a child had written it, became instantly iconic. It signaled that this place understood kids, spoke their language, existed for them. Kids don't want sophistication. They want abundance. They want to be overwhelmed by choice, to feel like they've entered a different world where adults' boring rules don't apply. Walking into Toys R Us was sensory overload in the best possible way. A maze of possibility where you could get lost, literally and figuratively, for hours. The warehouse format also solved a critical problem: inventory. Traditional department stores couldn't afford to stock deep, one or two of each toy, maybe. Toys R Us stocked dozens. If a toy was hot, they had it. If it sold out elsewhere, Toys R Us still had shelves full. This consistency made them indispensable to parents, especially during the holiday season when scarcity created panic. The company innovated in ways that seem quaint now, but were groundbreaking then. The Jeffrey dollar, a proprietary currency for kids that taught basic economics while building brand loyalty. The annual toy catalog, a telephone book-thick publication that arrived in mailboxes every fall and became required reading for children drafting Christmas lists. That catalog was more than marketing, it was a cultural artifact, a shared reference point for an entire generation. Toys R Us wasn't just a retailer, it was a kingmaker. When the company decided to stock a toy, that toy succeeded. When they gave prime shelf placement, that toy became a phenomenon. Toy manufacturers lived and died by Toys R Us orders. The company's buyers wielded enormous power, determining which toys reached mass market and which languished in obscurity. Japan, where retail space was precious, saw Toys R Us stores become pilgrimage sites. Europe embraced them. The brand adapted slightly for local markets but kept the core formula. Big stores, big selection, competitive prices. Behind this empire stood Charles Lazarus, still steering the ship he'd launched decades earlier. He'd taken the company public in 1978, then private again in a leveraged buyout in 2005. Lazarus was a retail genius who understood something fundamental. In specialty retail, scale is everything. Be so big that no one can compete. Offer so much that customers have no reason to go anywhere else. For a time, this strategy was invincible. The 1990s were Toys R Us's apex. The company seemed eternal, as permanent a fixture of American life as McDonald's or Coca-Cola. But cracks were forming, invisible at first, that would soon become chasms. The year 1994 should have been a warning. That was when a small online bookstore called Amazon launched. The year 2004 should have been a blaring alarm. That was when a young Mark Zuckerberg launched Facebook, accelerating the shift toward digital life. But the most critical year was 1998, the year Toys R Us made a decision that would haunt it forever. In 1998, Toys R Us launched ToysRUs.com. On paper, this looked like innovation. Embracing the internet, building an online presence. In reality, it was half-hearted, underinvested, and sabotaged by internal resistance. It was clear the company didn't really believe in e-commerce. It was checking a box, not embracing a revolution. Then, in 2000, Toys R Us made a deal that seemed brilliant at the time. They partnered with Amazon, outsourcing their entire online toy business. Amazon would handle the website, logistics, and fulfillment. Toys R Us would provide inventory and branding. It was supposed to be a marriage of strengths. Toys R Us's product expertise with Amazon's digital infrastructure. Instead, it was a catastrophe. Amazon had no interest in being a service provider. They were building their own empire. The partnership was rocky from the start. Toys R Us complained that Amazon sold competing products from other vendors. Amazon complained that Toys R Us couldn't keep up with demand. The relationship deteriorated into lawsuits and acrimony. By 2006, they'd severed ties, but the damage was done. Toys R Us had spent 6 critical years, 6 years during which e-commerce exploded, essentially sitting on the sidelines. When they finally tried to rebuild their own e-commerce operation, they were a decade behind Amazon, Walmart, and Target. The website remained clunky, the app was an afterthought, and the company never developed the logistics infrastructure to compete in an era when 2-day shipping was becoming standard. But the digital failure was only part of the problem. The stores themselves were deteriorating. Walk into a Toys R Us in 2010. The aisles that once felt infinite now felt chaotic and neglected. The industrial warehouse aesthetic that once signaled value now just looked cheap. The shelves were disorganized, action figures mixed with board games, no clear logic or curation. Finding anything required either luck or a defeated-looking employee. The experience had become joyless. The one thing a toy store should never be. Meanwhile, competitors were evolving. Target figured out how to make toy aisles feel curated and modern. Walmart leveraged logistics dominance to undercut prices. Amazon offered infinite selection from your couch. Specialty stores like Build-A-Bear and American Girl offered experiences. Not just products, but memories, interactivity, personalization. Toys R Us offered the same thing they'd offered in 1980. Abundant selection in a warehouse, except now abundant selection existed online. And the warehouse aesthetic felt dated, not charming. The company's leadership seemed paralyzed. Store renovations were discussed but never executed at scale. E-commerce investments were promised but always underfunded. There was talk of experiential retail, play areas, events, interactive displays. But these remained pilot programs, not systemic transformations. In 2005, Toys R Us had been taken private in a $6.6 billion leveraged buyout by Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado Realty Trust. This saddled the company with $5 billion in debt that required $400 million in annual interest payments. That's $400 million that couldn't be invested in store renovations, technology, or e-commerce. The company was essentially paying for its own acquisition rather than adapting to the future. But the problem ran deeper than debt. It was cultural. Toys R Us had succeeded for so long with the same formula that the idea of radical change felt dangerous, even heretical. The company culture rewarded continuity, not disruption. There's a concept in business called active inertia, when companies respond to change by accelerating activities that worked in the past, even when those activities no longer make sense. Toys R Us suffered from terminal active inertia. Facing competition from Amazon, they opened more big box stores. Facing criticism about store quality, they ran more promotions rather than renovating. Facing declining foot traffic, they doubled down on scale rather than experience. By 2010, the competitive landscape had fundamentally shifted, but Toys R Us was still fighting the war of 1990. Amazon wasn't just selling toys online, they were redefining customer expectations around convenience, speed, and price. Walmart wasn't just a discount retailer. They were using data and logistics to dominate every category, including toys. Target wasn't just cheaper, they were cooler, offering modern store design and curated selection. And Toys R Us? They were the place you went when you couldn't find what you wanted anywhere else. They'd gone from destination to last resort. Market share eroded year after year, from 25% in the 90s to 15% by 2010 to under 10% by 2015. Revenue declined, profits vanished, the debt became unsustainable. In 2017, the inevitable happened. Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The announcement shocked parents who'd grown up with the brand, but it shocked no one in retail. The company had been dying for years. Bankruptcy was just making it official. The plan was to reorganize, shed debt, and emerge leaner and more competitive. There was talk of experiential stores, of partnerships, of digital transformation. But it was too late. The company had no credibility with lenders, no cash to invest, no time to execute. The holiday season of 2017, typically a lifeline for toy retailers, was a disaster. Vendors, fearing they wouldn't get paid, refused to ship inventory. Shelves sat half empty. Customers stayed away. In March 2018, Toys R Us announced it was liquidating, closing all U.S. stores, laying off 33,000 employees, and ceasing operations entirely. The going out of business sales were heartbreaking. Desperate discounts, bare shelves, customers wandering aisles, taking selfies with Jeffrey the giraffe, trying to capture one last memory before it all disappeared. Employees, many of whom had worked there for decades, cried as they packed up the final inventory. By June 2018, it was over. The last store closed. The signs came down. The empire that Charles Lazarus built, the store that defined childhood for 3 generations, was gone. The collapse of Toys R Us wasn't a mystery. It was a case study in corporate failure, taught in business schools as a cautionary tale of what happens when companies refuse to evolve. The leveraged buyout crippled Toys R Us. That $5 billion in debt meant the company was always operating in survival mode, never in growth mode. Competitors like Target and Walmart were investing hundreds of millions in e-commerce and logistics. Toys R Us couldn't afford to compete. The LBO, meant to maximize value for private equity, extracted value instead, leaving the company a financial husk. In the 2010s, retail bifurcated. You either competed on price and convenience, Amazon, Walmart, or on experience, Apple Stores, Build-A-Bear. Toys R Us did neither. Their stores weren't cheap enough to compete with Walmart, weren't convenient enough to beat Amazon, and weren't experiential enough to justify a trip. They were stuck in a deadly middle ground, mediocre in every dimension. The failure to build a world-class e-commerce operation was unforgivable. This wasn't some unpredictable disruption. Everyone saw it coming. Amazon launched in 1994. By 2000, it was clear e-commerce mattered. By 2010, it was existential. Toys R Us had 2 decades to get it right and failed repeatedly. The outsourcing to Amazon was a particularly damaging mistake, essentially training a competitor and ceding ground in the channel that would define retail's future. Toys R Us assumed nostalgia would protect them. Parents who grew up with the brand would bring their kids out of loyalty. But loyalty doesn't overcome bad experiences. When stores are dirty, selection is poor, prices are high, and checkout lines are long, nostalgia evaporates. Even if leadership had wanted to transform Toys R Us, the culture resisted. The company was full of people who'd succeeded with the warehouse model and couldn't imagine alternatives. Suggesting radical change, closing stores, investing billions in digital, pivoting to experiences, felt like betraying the founder's vision. This cultural inertia was as lethal as the debt. Toys R Us needed to transform in 2005, maybe 2010 at the latest. By 2015, it was too late. Competitors had too much of a lead, the debt was too crushing, and consumer habits had shifted irreversibly. Companies that wait until crisis hits to change rarely survive. The tragedy of Toys R Us wasn't that they faced challenges. Every retailer faced the same pressures. Amazon, Walmart, changing consumer behavior. The tragedy was that Toys R Us had every advantage: brand recognition, customer loyalty, market position, and squandered it through inaction. Target adapted. They invested in store redesigns, built a world-class e-commerce operation, and created unique product lines. Walmart adapted. They bought Jet.com, built fulfillment infrastructure, and matched Amazon on price and speed. Even Best Buy, left for dead in 2012, adapted, becoming a showroom for electronics, offering installation services and price-matching Amazon. Toys R Us stood still, and in retail, standing still is moving backwards. The story should have ended there, a clean tragedy, a clear lesson. But this is America, where brands never truly die. They get resurrected, monetized, and hollowed out. In 2019, a year after liquidation, Toys R Us announced it was coming back. A new ownership group, this time led by former executives, promised a reimagined retail experience. 2 stores opened, one in Houston, one in New Jersey. The promise was experiential retail. The stores would be smaller, more curated, more interactive. There would be play areas, birthday party rooms, and, crucially, a partnership with Target to handle fulfillment. It sounded promising, like Toys R Us had finally learned the lessons of its failure. The reality was depressing. The stores were fine, not terrible, not amazing, just fine. The play areas were small, the selection was limited, the experience wasn't transformative. They felt like compromise, like what focus groups thought a toy store should be, not what kids actually wanted. Then COVID-19 hit, and those 2 stores closed. The resurrection died almost as fast as it began. But the brand wouldn't stay dead. In 2021, Toys R Us announced yet another comeback, this time through partnerships with Macy's and other department stores. Toys R Us sections would exist within existing retailers, leveraging their infrastructure. Jeffrey the Giraffe still appears in social media posts and marketing materials, but he's a mascot without a kingdom, a symbol of a chain that no longer exists. Some Toys R Us stores still operate in Canada, Asia, and parts of Europe. Franchises or subsidiaries that survived the US collapse. But they feel like echoes, distant memories of something that once felt universal. The brand continues to exist as intellectual property, valuable only as nostalgia, as a name that can be licensed, as a reminder of what was. It's not a resurrection. It's a zombie, a corpse propped up for commercial purposes. The death of Toys R Us hit harder than most retail closures because it represented something beyond commerce. It was the end of a ritual, a shared experience that defined childhoods across multiple generations. For millennials and Gen X, Toys R Us was foundational. It was where birthdays were celebrated, where Christmas lists came to life, where imagination had physical form. The store wasn't just about buying toys. It was about the experience of abundance, of being overwhelmed by possibility, of feeling like the world existed specifically for your joy. When those stores closed, something cultural closed with them. Yes, you can still buy toys. Amazon has more selection. Target has better prices. Specialty stores offer unique experiences. But none of them are Toys R Us. None of them have that same cultural weight, that same sense of pilgrimage. The closure also symbolized broader anxieties about retail's future. If Toys R Us, a beloved brand, a category leader, a company with massive built-in demand, couldn't survive, what could? The answer seemed to be only the most ruthless and efficient. Only Amazon and Walmart, companies optimized for scale and convenience rather than joy and experience. There's a specific kind of loss when a landmark of childhood disappears. It's not just nostalgia, it's grief. The stores where you experienced magic as a child are now parking lots. The places that made you happy no longer exist. It feels in some small but meaningful way like a piece of your past has been erased. Parents felt this acutely. They wanted to give their children the same experience they'd had, that sense of walking into a wonderland of toys. But they couldn't. That experience no longer existed. They could order from Amazon, scroll through Target, but they couldn't recreate the ritual of Toys R Us. The cultural conversation around the closure was surprisingly emotional. Social media filled with tributes, photos of old receipts, memories of birthday trips, stories of the specific toy they'd begged for and finally received. Journalists wrote elegies. Comedians made bittersweet jokes. The grief was real, even if it was grief for a store. This revealed something important. Retail, at its best, isn't transactional. It's experiential, emotional, even spiritual. The best stores aren't just places to buy things. They're places that make you feel something, that create memories, that become part of your story. Toys R Us, at its peak, did this brilliantly. At its end, it had forgotten how. The most painful part of the Toys R Us story is how avoidable it was. With different decisions, bolder leadership, smarter investments, willingness to evolve, the company could have survived, even thrived. Imagine if Toys R Us had invested in e-commerce early. What if instead of outsourcing to Amazon, they'd spent the early 2000s building world-class digital infrastructure? They had brand recognition, customer loyalty, and industry relationships. With serious investment, they could have been the Amazon of toys, dominating online the way they dominated physical retail. Embraced experiential retail. What if they'd transformed stores into destinations, play areas, birthday party spaces, interactive demos, character meet and greets? What if going to Toys R Us became an event, not just a shopping trip? Build-A-Bear proved this model works. Disney stores demonstrated it. Toys R Us had the brand and the space to do it better than anyone. Curated instead of overwhelming. What if they'd evolved from every toy to the best toys? Modern consumers value curation over abundance. Target's toy section succeeds because it's selective. Toys are chosen, organized, and presented thoughtfully. Toys R Us could have done this while maintaining broader selection than anyone else. What if, instead of fighting Amazon, they'd become the exclusive toy partner for a platform with shared values? Or created subscription boxes, loyalty programs, personalized recommendations? They had data on millions of kids' preferences. That data was valuable if used strategically. Owned the holiday season, Toys R Us could have leaned into being the Christmas destination, transforming stores seasonally with decorations, events, Santa meet and greets. They could have owned the cultural moment when toys matter most, making themselves indispensable even if customers shopped elsewhere the rest of the year. None of these strategies was impossible. Target executed several of them successfully. Amazon dominated digital. Specialty stores created experiences. The tools existed. Toys R Us simply refused to use them. The refusal came from multiple failures: leadership that lacked vision, private equity that prioritized short-term returns, a culture resistant to change, and a debt load that made investment impossible. But ultimately, it came from a fundamental misunderstanding of what they were selling. Toys R Us thought they sold toys. They didn't. They sold joy, wonder, and childhood magic. The toys were just the medium. When they forgot that, when they reduced the experience to transactions and inventory, they lost their reason to exist. Charles Lazarus, the founder who dreamed of a toy supermarket, died in March 2018, the same week Toys R Us announced liquidation. He was 94 years old. Some called the timing symbolic, even poetic. The creator and his creation dying together. Lazarus had built something extraordinary. He'd taken an industry that barely existed, specialty toy retail, and dominated it for half a century. He'd created a brand that transcended commerce, that became embedded in cultural memory, that shaped childhoods for 3 generations. But empires built on single visions often struggle to outlive their founders. Lazarus's model, the warehouse of abundance, was brilliant for the 20th century. It couldn't survive the 21st. The company needed to evolve, and it couldn't. The culture, the debt, the leadership, all conspired to keep Toys R Us frozen in time while the world moved on. Today, the brand exists as a specter, licensing deals, department store sections, international franchises. But the soul of Toys R Us, those vast wonderlands of childhood joy, is gone. The empty stores have been demolished or repurposed. The signs are collector's items. Jeffrey the giraffe tweets occasionally, a ghost performing for an audience that remembers but can't return. What's left is the lesson, painful and clear. Brands don't survive on nostalgia. They survive on relevance. Adaptation isn't betraying your legacy, refusal to adapt is. Toys R Us could have been Amazon before Amazon, Build-A-Bear before Build-A-Bear, Target's toy section, but everywhere. They had everything they needed: brand recognition, customer loyalty, industry relationships, and cultural importance. They just needed to change. And they wouldn't. In the end, Toys R Us didn't fail because of Amazon or Walmart or debt or private equity, though all of those contributed. It failed because it believed its own myth, because it confused past success with future invincibility, because it thought that being beloved meant being immortal. The most tragic businesses aren't the ones that never succeed. They're the ones that succeed brilliantly, then refuse to believe the world has changed. Toys R Us was a giant. But like all giants in fairy tales, it fell. And unlike in fairy tales, it's not getting back up. The parking lots remain empty. The buildings stand dark. Jeffrey the giraffe waves from old commercials and nostalgic Twitter accounts. But the magic, that sense of walking into a universe built just for you, is gone. And a generation of parents can't give their children what was given to them. That specific, irreplaceable joy of walking through automatic doors into a kingdom of toys, eyes wide, heart racing, believing, just for a moment, that anything was possible. That dream didn't die because dreams are fragile. It died because the people entrusted to protect it chose not to. And that might be the saddest part of all. Key takeaway: Toys R Us didn't fail because the world changed. It failed because it refused to change with it. Sometimes the biggest tragedy isn't losing something great, it's watching it destroy itself.